in terms of the connection between identity and freedom, in terms of the connection between democracy and identity in general. And I'd like to emphasize that a lot of what Mr. Sharansky says are things that are totally fine with me, and I'm sure they sound logical, reasonable, and so on. However, one thing that Mr. Sharansky failed to mention, and I think that we ought to mention anytime we talk about this conflict, is the occupation that's taking place over the Palestinians. This is something that's a very serious incident, and it's a great solvent, according to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, to human rights in the region. There's a lot of Palestinians that have suffered under the occupation, and there's a lot of Israelis that have suffered because of the occupation in Israel-Palestine. There's a lot of soldiers, Israeli soldiers from the IDF, some people that I actually knew and have great respect for, that basically talk about the occupation in Israel, or from Israel over the Palestinians, as being one that they refuse to serve in, as being one that they don't believe is justifiable. And I'm glad to hear Mr. Sharansky talking about a two-state solution, because that's precisely what has to happen in order for the conflict, this very long, dreadful, hideous conflict that's taken place between these two people for almost 100 years now, definitely after 1948, with the founding of Israel. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a Palestinian. I'm a Palestinian American. I'm American first and foremost because to be Palestinian anymore really doesn't mean much. I mean, we don't have a state. There's really no place to which I belong. I belong to this country, and I truly love this country. But as somebody who loves this country, I believe that our mission as Americans is to look out for justice. And I think that the Jewish state is a just idea. I think that Jews need to have a state to which they can return and which will save them from like the evils of Holocaust in Nazi Germany, save them from pogroms, save them from this very lengthy history of oppression and tyranny that they have suffered, including the history and tyranny that Mr. Sharansky himself has suffered under Soviet rule. So at the very outset, I have to say that I believe in the Jewish state. I think it's a good idea. And let me tell you why it's a good idea. There's one particular instance in the state of Israel's history that I'm very fond of, and one that I always look back to with surprise. When I first discovered it, I was sort of shocked. I mean, all of my life, I have heard people talking ill of the state of Israel. All of my life, I've heard people who talk very positively of the state of Israel. And when I went back to its founding document, the Israeli Declaration, or what's equivalent to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, I saw something that was very striking. And I quote, "We appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us, now for months, to the Arab inhabitants of the state of Israel, to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state of Israel on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions." This is a good thing, right? I mean, Israel is a universal democracy insofar as that appeal is talking to both Arabs and Jews. The Declaration of Independence recognized the existence of the Arabs. The Declaration of Independence understood that there were people called the Palestinians. And the Declaration of Independence also understood the grave circumstances in which Israel was existing in. Now, I agree with Mr. Sharansky that there has to be a connection between freedom and identity. But at the same time, I think it's an identity that we have to subscribe to, kind of like American identity, right? One that is based on the proposition that all men and women, are created equal by their Creator, and that they're endowed with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think there's a tinge of that in the founding document of the State of Israel. And this is why I cannot in good conscience say that I'm against the State of Israel. And this is why a lot of Palestinians deeply know it, right? We can't be against the State of Israel because there's a lot that we could see, a lot of goodwill that we could see from the State of Israel towards its Jewish members. And therefore, we ought to acknowledge that that goodwill could actually be applied equally to the Palestinians. In this case, the two-state solution. Israel has to end its occupation. I'm sure that the Israelis don't want the occupation any more than Palestinians want the occupation. A little something about this occupation. It's resulted in a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. It's resulted in what the Pope has called Pope's Justice Minister has called a big concentration camp. It's resulted in what even Pat Buchanan, a conservative, and I'm sure my DePaul Conservative Alliance students like this guy, has called somewhat of a concentration camp. Sorry, no Freudian slip there. And it's resulted in massive unemployment for Palestinians, including the deaths of a lot of people, a lot of children, a lot of women, and militants as well. Let's face it, the Palestinians made a bad choice by electing Hamas. But if we respect democracy, as Mr. Sharansky is calling us to do, ought we not respect the freest and fairest election, one of the freest and fairest elections in the Middle East, according to Jimmy Carter? I don't care how you feel about Carter, but he was there observing the election, and he thought that it was free and fair. What I'm saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, is this. It's pretty simple. I don't like Hamas. My whole family doesn't like Hamas. A lot of Palestinians that I talk to don't like Hamas, but they got voted for. They got elected. A lot of people that I knew didn't like George W. Bush either, regardless of how I feel personally about George W. Bush. He got elected, and he stayed in office for 8 years. What I'm telling you is that if we want to respect democracy, whether identity-based or not, we have to respect people's choices. Lest we confuse the issue. I don't want to be seen as defending Hamas. I told you I love this country, and this country considers Hamas a terrorist organization. But they got into office. What do we do now? My proposition is a pretty simple one. Allow Hamas to fail. The PLO failed. They lost the election. Hamas won the election by like 46%. They didn't really win a majority, but they still won. Should we not respect Palestinians' democracy? If we truly want a Palestinian state that's democratic, should we not trust the democratic process that brought about Hamas? As hideous as Hamas might seem to us, should we not at least appreciate the fact that the Palestinian people actually voted for this group in rejection of the tyranny of Arafat? If we truly care about Palestinian democracy, should we not end the occupation over the Palestinians? The occupation, which basically is one of the most undemocratic things in the Middle East? If we truly respect Palestinian dignity, should we not help them in establishing a secular, modern, democratic state? And in this regard, I'm grateful that Mr. Sharansky has preempted me on this issue and has spoken of a democratic Palestine. I believe in a democratic Palestine, not as a Palestinian. I've given up my Palestinian identity long ago when I took up American citizenship. But as an American, I respect Palestinian democracy. Because the fact is, if Palestine is a democracy, it would be friendlier to us. If Palestine is a democracy, it would be friendlier to Israel. If the people are actually allowed to live and thrive and sustain themselves independent of any other force once they gain their independence that way, I think they would make some of the best friends that the world has ever known. And this is why I'm a firm believer of a democratic Palestine as much as I'm a firm believer in democratic Iraq, or a democratic Iran, or a democratic Saudi Arabia, inshallah. I believe in democracy, and I think that the democratic project is not a bad idea. It's a good idea for which we should die. I would be willing to fight and die for democracy myself. Not simply as an American, but as a human being, right? I believe that human beings want to be free. Now, I also agree that our American identity is also very important to our sustaining of democracy. And therefore, I also believe in that connection between democracy and identity. It's just that democracy, if it's truly to be a democratic system, has to be devoid of this sort of penurious, ungenerous identity that is exhibited by Hamas, for example. This idea that we are Muslim and they are Jewish ought to be condemned through and through. As much as the idea of we are Jewish and they are Muslim ought to be condemned, as much as any extremism ought to be condemned. We should stand against extremism because it's bad for America.